Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Ana Valdivia. I'm a lecturer in AI, Government and Policy. And today I have the pleasure to chair this session on critical data studies with Latin America, theorizing beyond data colonialism. So we are delighted to have here Dr. Jonas Valente and Dr. Rafael Grohmann joining online from Toronto to discuss views around dependence, oppressions, and liberation, debating how Latin American authors can be useful for current critical data studies in a more nuanced and complex vision. So Jonas Valente is a postdoctoral researcher in the Oxford Internet Institute, and also an amazing person if you don't know him personally, and responsible for co-lead the Cloudwork project inside Fairwork Foundation. So Jonas is a Brazilian researcher with a sociology PhD, and his thesis focused on digital platforms, receiving an honorable mention in the UNB Thesis Awards and being nominated for the CAPES Thesis Award. His area of interest includes digital technologies, digital platforms, the internet, labor, technology, and communications. Rafael Grohmann is assistant professor of media studies at the University of Toronto, leader of the DG Labor Initiative and principal investigator of Worker on Intersectional Platforms project. He is also a researcher of Fair Work and Platforms Work Inclusion Living Lab projects. Rafael is co-director of the Critical Digital Methods Institute. So just for your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. The presentation will run about like 34 minutes, followed by a discussion at the end. So either if you're joining online or here, feel free to post your questions if you're online on Zoom. And if you are here, just raise your hand. I will be happy to accommodate like the questions. So if you wish to ask questions with your mic or camera, please feel free also like to make them available. So it's very great to have you here, and Dr. Jonas Valente, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anna, and I'd like to thank everyone that is here today. I'd like to thank Dr. Rafael Grohmann, with whom we wrote this paper, and the editors of Big Data in Society. So this presentation is about a paper that it has already been published, so you'll be able to read it and check it in more detail. And to thank the OII for opening this space for us. And I would like to begin actually with the final part of the paper that are the limitations. So it would be impossible, even in a book and of course in a paper, to explore all the richness of the Latin American social thought. So we cannot, we couldn't do it, and we highly encourage all of you, if you think that after the presentation or reading the paper that this is something that you are interested in, to explore hundreds and hundreds of other authors and scholars that are producing such a rich understanding, not only from Latin America, but the world. So it's important to know that we just picked one group of scholars and two scholars, and that at least we understood that we could kind of articulate the way that their thoughts help us to understand critical data studies. So to start the agenda, I just would like to say, so what were the aims of that? So first aim was that it's important to shed light in this other scholars, theories, and theoretical methodological approaches that are not from the global north. And this is not new, of course, but unfortunately, we still have a relative visibility of this. Sometimes we check new authors because we are discussing about the internet and many aspects that we are discussing here at the OII. But sometimes, not necessarily, we see how the social thought from Latin America, from Africa, or from Asia can help us to not only to widen a little bit our lens and our analytical lens beyond the classical, and classical is already a terrible term, but beyond what we were taught to be the classical social science authors. And so that's why I think this dialogue is so important. A second point here is that we would like, in addition to bring Latin American authors, to highlight those three, so this first group of authors and these two other authors. So because we understand that critical data studies will be better explained if we look at oppression, dependency, and alternative process of liberation, as we're going to discuss here. So that's why we selected Lelia Gonzalez, that is a Brazilian sociologist, and among other like social science fields, the dependency theorists, and Enrique Dussel, that is an Argentinian philosopher, but spent the most of his time in Mexico and very recently passed away. So unfortunately, we lost Enrique Dussel, but he left an enormous work as Lelia Gonzalez and other theorists here. So basically, we have two main arguments is that, again, as I said, the history of social thought from Latin America should be used not only to explain the world, but in our case, since we are here studying the internet, but to discuss critically the internet. And the second point is that we can have an important contribution in addition to what Latin America has been more known about. And this is what we have been calling decolonial thoughts. So there is a big conceptual discussion because you have in other parts of the world sometimes referred to as post-colonial studies, but in Latin America, we have this tradition of decolonization and decolonial thinkers as Quijano, Segato, Walsh, Mignolo, and a lot of others. And the decolonial term has been influencing a lot of fields in social sciences, including internet studies. So we can see that Dr. Ana Valdivia is a scholar in AI. She is very familiar, and other that are studying internet, AI, algorithms as well. You can listen and read a lot of works on how decolonize technologies, how decolonize the internet. But what we wanted to bring here is that this critique of data universalism and the coloniality of power that is, as we can see, and Rafael will speak more about that, we have a growing body of literature looking at the decolonial perspective. This can be enriched with those other perspectives that we are bringing here. So it would be impossible to summarize how many Latin American social thinkers, but in the beginning of the paper, we try to mention some of them. So there's a history of centuries of social thought, and we could go way back if we can talk about indigenous thinkers and other cosmovisions, but we just mentioned some of them, and this goes in all fields of knowledge. And that's why we believe that this is just one small contribution to highlight part of those scholars and those thinkers, and to say that they deserve to be more known in Global North. So let's start with what was called dependency theory. So here we have Vânia Bambirra, Rui Mauro Marini, and Teotônio dos Santos, but you have many others. The three are, we had the three that made their career in Brazil, but this is not a group only in Brazil. We have Jaime Osorio, Valente, and other thinkers that are in Mexico, that are in different parts of Latin America. And basically what the dependency theory did was to understand how we have differences in development levels, because the mainstream explanation of underdevelopment was that development is a kind of a continuum. So you have a ladder in which the underdeveloped countries need to repeat what the developed countries are doing. And what they want to highlight, and they do that, is basically to say this is an inappropriate way of seeing development, because the developed countries can only be developed because they have an unequal relationship with underdeveloped countries. And then you have different stories. You have, for instance, we are here in Britain, where the situation of former British colony like India and others is much more visible. But if we look at Latin America, we're talking about countries that were colonies until the beginning of the 19th century. So they have a history that developed other forms of subordination, and those forms of subordination are relationships of subordination within capitalism, and not necessarily only as colonies. So the colonial relationship is not the only explanation analytical tool that we can use to understand why the nations from the global south are the way they are and how they were exploited and subordinated by other nations. So those nations, and they bring the situation from Latin America, but they talk about other nations as well. They have losses resulting from these unequal exchanges. And what the ruling classes within those nations do is that to compensate the difficulties to compete in the international market, they need to increase the rate of exploitation of their working class. So this leads to what those authors, especially Mauro Morini, calls super exploitation of labor. So the way that they can gather and they can like extract enough value to compete in the international market. Of course, this is not like a continuum, this is not without differences. So we have like dependent economies that during some situations, during wars or substituting importations, they could develop a little bit. But if we look at, for instance, at Latin American economies, especially in the southern part of Latin America, during the second half of the 20th century, a lot of this development was done at the cost of workers and at the cost of democracies as well, because we had a lot of dictatorship systems there. So this is something that is important for us to understand. Teotônio dos Santos is going to discuss how dependency can take different forms. So we can have, yes, of course, colonial dependency. We can have an industrial entrepreneurial dependency, but we also have more sophisticated forms of dependency that, for instance, he calls technological industrial dependency, with the global north nations producing more sophisticated, and this is also a concept that we can question, but like cutting edge technology products, equipments, technologies, while we have the global south providing workforce to be exploited, and more recently, as Rafael is going to discuss, a mass of people to provide data about. So what are the contributions that the dependency theory can bring? So to understand the international division of labor and how we can look at the international division of labor when we look at digital technologies and when we look at data. And this is important because the role of the population from the global south, it's not only to be source of data to be extracted. So this is something that we need to consider, and especially when we talk about digital and data work that we have been discussing with our colleagues from the Framework Project. Also, they bring a discussion about how the dependency patterns reproduce the dependency condition. So it's not only that underdeveloped countries are not applying the toolbox that will liberate them or improve their situations. It's just that the way that relations are built, and we have a situation now, we have wars, we have decisions from international organizations, this reproduces and amplifies the dependent condition of those countries. And when we look at the global south, it's important not only to see the dependent and the problematic side, but also to acknowledge the global south countries as sites of knowledge production, even if they provide raw material, they provide data, and they provide workforce. So jumping a little bit, we have Lelia Gonzalez here. So as I told, she was a Brazilian social scientist and thinker, and a little before some of the most renowned Black feminists, she was already bringing like an intersectional approach, even if she didn't use the word intersectional, but she was articulating race, gender, and class, and how systems of oppression and exploitation are caused by what she called like colonialism, legacies, Eurocentric knowledge, and she underlined how the scientific justifications legitimize practices of violence. So she was criticizing racism, she was criticizing, including inside leftist groups, leftist parties. So she criticized sometimes the white women's movement, sometimes the Black movement because of sexism and other relationships. And one of the things when she analyzed the situation in Brazil, she used some psychoanalysis categories to discuss and to point out how we can have open and veiled racist practices. So not all the racist practices are like explicit, and it doesn't mean that this is not a violent and problematic situation. On the contrary, when you have a society denying that you have these oppression relationships, sometimes it's harder to fight them and to correct the problems that you see. So this is a way in which Lelia can capture the subtleties of these oppressions. And again, focusing on racial oppressions, but always articulating this with the situation of Black women and Black worker women. So the intersectional concern is very present in Lelia's work. She analyzed not only Brazil, but she expanded her analysis to understand how Latin America connected to Africa. And then she created this term, Amefrica Ladina, that is a term mixing the words Africa and Latin America, and this other category, Americanity. So to highlight that in Latin, first of all, that we cannot talk about America as one entity, and this is something that also forces Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean to be put like under the same category as global North countries like the US and Canada. And that, of course, you need to acknowledge on one side the indigenous history of Latin America, and on the other side, this influence, this Afrocentric influence of this African American part. And understand that, again, is to understand the relationship of oppression on one side, and on the other side, acknowledge those as subjects that produce knowledge, as subjects that organize themselves, as subjects that have alternative projects. And these alternative projects, as we discussed in the paper, they are part of what we need to incorporate. Of course, that race and gender and intersectionality is not a new discussion, especially in critical data studies. So we have other authors that have been discussing that. We mentioned a lot of them, and Rafael is going to detail this a little more. But we believe that Lelia is one author that was discussing that in the 60s, in the 70s, and need to be acknowledged, in addition to what we already know, the classical authors from the US, from Europe, and from other countries as well. So Lelia articulates, and like we can use the race and technology literature in a way that she looks at specific ways of intersectional oppressions that are not what was in the US or are not what happened like in specific colonies, but that can bridge Latin America and Africa. And this is not only to understand those two continents, but it's to understand a huge part of the global South and to reconfigure and to resignify the intersectional lens itself. So what we're talking about when we talk about intersectional, and why we cannot forget about the class element of the intersectional, because sometimes like there was a very important critique from the Black women movement in the 70s, in the 80s, against the labor movement, saying you're not acknowledging gender, you're not acknowledging race, but we cannot forget that class is still a way of explaining oppressions in capitalism. So Lelia articulates this a lot. And we think that the way that she does that and the way that she connects the Amefrica Ladina, so Latin America with Africa, and the way that she reads specific forms of oppression, like the open and veiled races, this can connect to a lot of points as Rafael is going to explore. So finally, before I hand over to Rafael, we have Enrique Dussel. So Enrique Dussel also, as Lelia Gonzalez, provided a very strong critique of the pretense idea of civilization, idea of universalism, and the idea that justified, according to Dussel, what the Eurocentrism justified as a modernity, a violence that occurred, again, not only as colonial regimes, but also as other forms of violence and subordination. And this connects directly to what the dependency theory brought to us. So what Enrique Dussel did is that, and he has an amazing book called 1492, where he discusses the importance in which Europe builds its image of the world and the image of Europe itself based on how they invaded, conquered, and massacred nations in the global south. And Enrique Dussel did not only discuss, he is a philosopher, so he was discussing social theory and the theory of knowledge as a whole, but he dedicated some time for technology, and he discussed how technology is connected to relations of oppression and exploitation. And he proposes an alternative process, an alternative project that he calls the ethics or the philosophy or the politics of liberation. So when he talks about liberation, he talks about start from the victims of the system. So the victims are the slaves, the victims are the women, the non-whites, the workers, the indigenous, and those victims build a process of self-awareness. And from the self-awareness of the oppression relations, they build new projects. And when we talk about, and then Rafael, you can prepare yourself because I'm gonna hand over to you. When Enrique Dussel talks, when we talk about beyond data colonialism, is that because Dussel says that it's not only about decolonize. He talks about the transmodern pluriverse, but he says that we need to take a step further. It's about building something completely new and not only or go back to what was before Europe conquered, massacred, and invaded lots of nations around the world, but also to think in the concrete context, an ethics of liberation based in humanity. So we understand that, first of all, his decolonial thinking connects to a lot of discussions that we have from other authors, and he centered the pivotal role of the oppressed in its multiple dimensions. So it's not only about criticizing, it's about acknowledging, understanding this relationship of oppressions, understanding this not only in a very hyper-localized way, but connect this with the global international division of labor and global realities, and also discuss which kind of alternative process he calls liberation. And we understand that the idea of liberation can be very helpful to discuss data studies. So now I'll hand over to Rafael that will discuss how we can explore a little further this dialogue with critical data studies. Rafael?
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, let me just...
Great. So sorry for not attending in person. I am in São Paulo right now. Thank you for having us for this event. First of all, this article and our presentation is more an invitation to start to get to know other authors beyond the colonial approaches in Latin America, because we have a lot of authors. And in this article, we just did a small part of this work. And we hope this can inspire other authors beyond Latin America to engage with Latin American social theory, to think about platform studies and data studies. I can acknowledge some other Latin American authors doing this kind of work, like Kenzo Soares in an article already published in Big Data in Society on platform sub-imperialism, Tarcísio Silva, Thais Oliveira, Rodrigo Guedes, Bianca Kramer, people who are doing and engaging with those theories too. Jonas, can you share?
So next
Amazing. One. So I will show to you some of the dialogues with critical data studies and critical platform studies too. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is a table we produced for our article, trying to synthesize some of the main concepts of Lelia Gonzalez dependency theory and Marxist dependency theory and Enrique Dussel. in order to how these old concepts can relate to some of the current debates in critical data studies, in critical platform studies. For instance, how we can understand the notion of Amefrica Ladina and Americanity with the notion of platform racial capitalism. And some authors like Delia Gabriel is working on these perspectives, or algorithm racism, or trying to improve intersectional approach to data platforms and algorithms, thinking not only in relation to oppressions, but also in terms of liberations, in terms of how Enrique Dussel approached those things, in terms of technological liberation and politics of liberation, and how this can connect with debates around data commons or data justice, or when we read with data, or even with informatics of oppress or data practices from the margins, and how Marxist theory of dependence can connect with current debates around platform imperialism or sub-imperialism, and also on global inequalities and platform labor. I will show you some examples in the way in my own research I'm doing some of these connections. Next slide, please. In my own research, there's a clear connection between Marxist theory of dependency and AI, and especially data work behind AI. A lot of scholars nowadays are working on concepts like global production networks of AI. And so nowadays we know some of the working conditions of data work in the global south, in Philippines or Kenya, or in Latin America, especially countries like Venezuela, Argentina, Colombia, and Brazil. But we don't have exactly the connections between the BPOs located in the global south, or people working for platforms like Appen or Amazon Mechanical Turk in Latin America, with the lead AI firms in North America and Europe, from many sectors like automotive sector or media sector. We have to do these connections in order to highlight again the international division of labor, in some cases the international division of cultural labor too, and how this increase or intensify the dependency of Latin American countries in relation to AI development, or in relation to AI context, or how the notion of super exploitation can be useful to think about data workers in the global south. And also we are talking a lot of sovereignty in our research agenda in critical data studies, but here is a reminder that if we will take this in a dialectical way, we have to think on sovereignty in relation to dependency too, because it's not only about sovereignty, but we are facing a lot of dependency in this kind of AI development, or this global production networks of AI. Next slide, please. However, most of research, most of data and platform research focused on dependency as a neutral value. For instance, people depending on platforms in order to receive payment, or people depending on infrastructures of platforms in order to work or live, or so on. But in the scholarship around platforms and data, specifically in this case, platform labor, the dependency concept is a little bit neutral. So there's a lack of what this dependency means in a macro level or in a political economy level. So Marx's theory of dependency can be useful to theorize platform studies and in relation to this notion of dependency. Next slide, please. In relation to tech liberation or autonomy, we are seeing a lot of experimental or prototypical examples in Latin America in relation to producing and developing tech for workers or from territories people habit in Latin America. Here are two examples. The first one is the Argentina Federation of Tech Co-op, and how they are arguing for a tech liberation or tech autonomy for workers in Argentina. They re-territorialized the Co-op Cycle Federation and European Federation, not only adapting this app for Latin American context, but also trying to connect the technologies with the territories and how they argue around that. And the second example is the technology division of homeless worker movement in Brazil. So the homeless worker movement, the largest urban social movement in Brazil, decided to have a technology division in order to organize tech workers, in order to develop and create technologies for other workers, especially in the construction sector, in the cleaning sector. And last year, in partnership with me and my department, we co-wrote a primer on digital sovereignty from the workers' perspective. So they are arguing that digital sovereignty or autonomy, these are not only from like state or something, but also from the worker, the perspective of workers. I know some of you like gossips. I really like gossips. Just to let you know, for your information, tonight we will have a beer between Argentinian Federation of Tech Co-ops and homeless worker movement here in São Paulo. And this is the main reason I'm not there in person. Next slide, please. So two more Argentinian and Brazilian examples. One is called Alternativa Laboral Trans, tech co-op only by trans people, and Maria Lab, a feminist hacker space based in São Paulo. And they argue not only an autonomy for the workers, especially for women and queer people, but also taking seriously an intersectional approach, recognizing the oppressions, but also taking and like recoding gender, race, and class, and sexuality and age in order to create their technologies from a transfeminist gender approach. Next slide, please. So there are some lessons from our initial article or our initial try to articulate these three perspectives with critical data and platform studies. These are not exactly like original lessons, but there's some important lessons there. The first one is are the perspective from the oppressed people in the datafication context, considering these people as subjects of knowledge, or they have agency, or in a dialectical way in order to neither romanticize their agency. Oh, you are warriors, or you are the super women and so on. But also trying to understand how they are struggling with oppressions and how they're struggling for liberation. There's a lesson to take seriously an intersectional approach for data studies. There's some gaps in critical platform and critical data studies in order to not so many. We talk a lot about intersectionality, but when you take like a deep eye, it's difficult to see in a methodological way these intersectional approaches. And one good reminder is to have this different dimensions or layers in terms to power relations, both in the micro context, in the everyday life of people, but also in a political economy approach in order to understand the world systems and how the data production and circulation occurs in these world systems. And also a reminder in order to not be fatalist, as Payo Aurora published in an article yesterday, the privilege of being pessimist in the global north and how we need liberation-oriented strategies in tech in relation to technologies. And I'd like to finish my our presentation reminder. These authors are only three. We have a lot of Latin American authors. Only from Brazil, I can remind of Milton Santos, for instance, in the notion of territory. We can talk about Álvaro Vieira Pinto, a professor of Paulo Freire with 1,000 more than a 1,000 page book on technology in the 70s. We are seeing a lot of this 70s nostalgia in our critical data studies, and this is good in order to recover this so-called old theories and old authors to think about unresolved problems in our world nowadays. And I would like to invite all of you to continue this conversation and read and engage with other authors. And I don't know if you know many other journals, but we just launched a new journal called Platforms in Society. And we would love to receive more and more articles articulating Latin American theories with platform studies and data studies. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jonas and Rafael, for this fascinating talk. I think that we will really enjoy to learn more about Latin American scholars and academics and how they can contribute to critical data studies. So I have some questions, but I would like to invite someone in the room to ask a first question. Otherwise, I could ask first questions like why Lelia Gonzalez and Enrique Dussel were, when there are like so many other also brilliant Latin American academics and also non-academic, like when you were presenting this idea of like analyzing critical studies from the oppressed, the Zapatistas came out with this epistemology of looking at the world from below and on the left. That is like a similar approach, right? So why you focus on these two academics and why into like academics and rather not to think about other sort of like contributions beyond academia to also like enrich this critical data studies field.
Do you want to start, Rafael, and then I can speak?
Yeah, I can start talking that my first article published in Portuguese, in English, was about Álvaro Vieira Pinto in Triple C in 2016. For me, it's a long-term and collective approach. Maybe we can like co-edit together that's a collection around all these lessons, possibly in 3 languages, English, Portuguese, and Spanish. We have to start with something. Our approach with Jonas started with this this concern to not put all Latin American theories in the colonial box. And how, like, we have to do a selection. There's some personal preferences. In my case, I am engaging with Marxist theory of dependency right now. And another issue is trying to put other authors in this circle. For instance, Zapatista, there's a lot of other authors already doing like amazing work and so on with a lot of other issue. But for me, this article is like a small contribution exactly because of that. They're only like recognizing the limits. They're only like 3 authors, and we prefer to focus on 3 authors than talk a lot about a lot of authors and not exactly engaging with them.
So very quickly, I think that this is the main, it's not a weakness, but this is something that it's easy to question in the article, because yeah, you were talking about a region that is gigantic with like hundreds of centuries, like lots of centuries of social thinking. So you can easily question what not talk about over Vieira Pinto. We received a review saying, why are you not talking about Paulo Freire? Or why are you not talking about Milton Santos? And then we responded saying, this works for all the social thinkings in Latin America. So what I would justify is that, first of all, the decolonial turn has the discussion of intersectional oppressions as one of its pillars. And we understood that bring an author that is not so known, but it was discussing that back then in the 60s was important. So that's why Lelia Gonzalez is a crucial part of this paper. Second of all, the dependency theory is something very like not looked in many discussions that we had about technology. Rui Mauro Marini wrote in 1973. He was translated now, I think in 2023. So it's a theory that discusses, again, we don't want to reduce Latin America or the global South only to colonies or colonial legacies. We want to bring the specificity of how thinkers considered both sides of this oppression. So the colonial legacies on one side and independent, like capitalist subordination relationships on the others. And then dependence theory was super important on that. Why Dussel and not the Zapatistas, for instance? I think that Dussel has 2 strengths. The first of all is he's one of the thinkers that has a decolonial like expression, and his book that I mentioned, 1492, is about that. It's about criticizing modernity, criticizing Eurocentrism. Has this on one side, but he's the one provoking us to go beyond the decolonial turn when he says it's not only about decolonizing, and then we can recover, as Rafael just said, his theory of liberation to discuss, okay, if we are not just decolonizing, what are we proposing? And he has this project about the politics, like philosophy of liberation. But certainly this is just like a part of many authors that we could have explored.
Okay. Rafael, do you want
to? I have one thing to say. Like all these authors were already activists. They especially Lelia Gonzalez and all the authors of Marxist theory of dependency, they were most recognized in social movements and communist political parties than in academia. Actually, and even in Brazil, like my bachelor was in sociology, and my professor said, like in 2000s, that these authors were not serious because they are so militant. They're too much militant to go to academia, and all these authors were had to go from Brazil to other countries during dictatorship too. So this is a tradition of Latin American thought in a critical thought in general.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have 2 questions already online. So I'm gonna gather a few questions in the room, and then we will jump into the questions on Zoom. So
great, thank you for the conversation, Brian. Looking at also like new country that begins to be conceptualized how we think.
Just one thing, Rafael, can you listen?
We can repeat the question. I think it's better.
Okay.
Yeah, we can repeat the question.
Try to speak louder. So authors like New Quadri from LSE, for example, are trying to rethink how we look at data colonialism, especially from the perspective of how big tech companies are beginning to leverage data relations to exploit people, data labels, stuff like that. So I was thinking, how do you see this sort of relationship with the way you think about data colonialism in the traditional way we know about it, and perhaps the new forms of data colonialism? Do you think they are quite different, or there are lessons we can learn from both perspectives?
So
The question was,
The one maybe.
so what is the relationship about your paper and other theories on data colonialism like Nick Codry at LSE? So what are you going to contribute to this concept? Or how do you engage with that concept?
Great. First of all, I know Nick Codry before he started to write data colonialism, and one of the favorite authors of Nick Codry actually is a Spanish Colombian author called Jesus Martin Barbero, and so famous in media studies. And we are part of the same research network called Tierra Común. Maybe one of the things, and Ana Valdivia also is part of this research network. Maybe one of our contribution to this debate is to, especially like people like Nick Codry or other data colonialism researchers, to get to know other approaches that can be complementary or can go like beyond, and not only colonialism explain all the issues, or instead to be decolonial, you can be anti-imperialist too, or other approaches. So for me, this enrich this debate. This debate is not exactly in like an attack or something on it, but arguing that even this notion of colonialism, and there is another book, I forgot the author, but the book is called Tech Imperialism. So we are recovering a lot of social concepts from 60s and 70s because we have a crisis nowadays, and the current theories and tools are not sufficient for us. So for me, it's part of this broader understanding of it. Jonas?
Do you want to jump to another question?
No, I just want to say something about
Please.
so I think that question is very, very relevant because I've seen how in critical data studies, everyone is looking at the coloniality, right? And when you say this word and they say the coloniality, you cut the attention of people. But when you go to the ground, you see that what is going on, and I think that this, what Jonas and Rafael presented today, explains that very nicely from a theoretical perspective. When you go to the ground, so I was doing fieldwork in Mexico, and I've observed like how data centers there are extracting water, but people who work in these data centers are the managers, they're Mexicans. So I struggle to see like this the colonial perspective into this water extractivism. And for me, the colonial framework was not useful to understand what I observed in the fieldwork.
So just to make sure that even if our paper title is Theorizing Beyond, we don't engage with this discussion because this discussion demands like serious, like deep debates on what are the weaknesses of the decolonial. But so I'm not talking about the paper, just like sharing my opinion in line with Ana and Rafael. It's that Latin American shows us that colonial legacies are not the only way of building oppressions and building asymmetries of power. But of course, you can respond saying that, but they're not talking about colonialism. You have many authors talking about, as Ana just mentioned, coloniality. So this is a project of exploitation and subordination and stuff like that. But then you can ask, what is the role of the US in coloniality? Where's the role of China in coloniality? African countries are discussing how China is buying lots and lots of lands, and like the same in the Latin America as well. So I just agreeing with Ana. What we wanted to say is that the colonial legacy and understanding the oppression that derived from this colonial legacy, this is super important. And Lelia is saying that, and also Enrique Dussel is saying that, and the dependency theory is saying that. But we need to go like beyond that, like how we understand the asymmetries of power in the international division of labor in capitalism. And I think this is the missing word of the discussion. And it's very curious, to not say funny, that capitalisms disappear from the explaining frameworks. Like we are in a capitalist system, but it's not mentioned. So that's why I think that we can use a lot of things from decolonial perspectives. I have a little problem with the concept of like digital or data colonialism, because when you compare, you have a lot of differences. But you can use like analytical tools from decolonial authors and then enrich them with other authors that are trying to bring us. We had this very, very small effort here.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to now read three questions actually that we have online. Two of them are very related. So I think I'm going to read them together because they are related. So first question is from Maria Julia Costa. And she says, good afternoon, professors. First of all, congratulations on the excellent article. I'm master's student in labor law at UFMG, and I'm studying platform labor from the Marxist theory perspective. Currently, I'm working on an article about the approach to platform labor from the Marxist theory of dependence and the colonial theories. Your article has brought great contributions to my research and is indeed one of the few to address the topic. One of my hypotheses is that José Nunes' concept of the marginal mass, also claimed by Gonzalez, is very important in addressing platform labor in Brazil and complements the Marxist theory of dependence. I would like to hear your thoughts on this association, as well as on the relationship between the concept of digital colonialism and labor super exploitation. Thank you. And then the next question related to this one is from Dina that asks, thinking about exploitative data work in the Global South, what do you see as the most urgent next steps to improve the conditions for data workers?
Rafael, you can start, then you go.
Yeah, first of all, I am happy with people engaging with Marxist theory of dependency in order to understand platforms and labor. I've attended a PhD defense in the last month by Rodrigo Guedes in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who did a PhD dissertation on Marxist theory of dependency and platformization of education. So these are good news, and I'm seeing more colleagues, even in Toronto, with more interest to discuss Marxist theory of dependency, even because, as Jonas mentioned, the book by Mauro Marini was translated only in 2022. So only now people are seeing that theory of dependency is not only about Fernando Henrique Cardoso, like Morozov was in Brazil last year, and he mentioned only Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and the people were like a little bit afraid. It's not only this way to understand dependency. In relation to Dina's question, for me personally, is include data workers in local regulations and local policies, because at least in Brazil, they are not present in the platform labor regulation, and they are not present in the AI regulation in the country. So how to include data workers in local policies, but considering all this international division of labor and the global production networks of AI, we have to not only make global or global north tech companies accountable, and this is so difficult because they fund a lot of research and so on this topic, but also we have to pressure transnational bodies like International Labor Organization, and currently United Nations created a high-level advisory board in around AI. And we have to pressure these bodies to address global costs of AI and global costs of data work. So for me, this is one of their urgent tasks. Maybe Jonas can add that.
Yeah, I think this question is amazing, and it shows that we just brought three examples. Like, for instance, I don't know, Maria Julia's referenced José Nunes, and it's great that you were working with this author and connecting to Lelia and others. And this is one example of how like you can use the global north authors, and not on that you need to like ban our global. No, of course, Marx already spoke about lumpen proletariat, but you have specificities of how this marginalized mass or how the lumpen proletariat happens. Like in Brazil, we have a specific reality, like after slavery was abolished, you had lots and lots of law to criminalize, like, so you freed Black people, but then you criminalize Black people because they didn't have a job, they didn't have a home, but they could not stay in the street. So you have a specific mechanism through which not only Black people, but indigenous people, they were oppressed in those situations. Of course, this is not only in Latin America and other continents as well. And I think that one interesting point about what Maria Julia is bringing is that how can we understand this population that is in a precarious situation? And it's important to remember, for instance, this is something that we discuss a lot at Fair Work, because the Global North often talks about gig economy, but the gig economy is the normal economy from the Global South in a lot of countries. Of course, not in all countries, but in a lot of countries. So how do you get this mass of people that is already informal, is already in a precarious situation, and see how platform work sometimes improves, but a lot of times use this narrative of improvement to keep a precarity relationship, and how to fight that? So my colleagues, Dr. von der Spielde, also Elianak, I, Rafael, and many others, we have this project here called Fair Work, in which we discuss exactly that. So what are the standards relating to pay, conditions, managements, and other? And as Rafael mentioned, we have a specific project led by Dr. von der Spielde and Dr. Ozo Elianak, in which we look at AI. So you have this invisible that is not invisible, and that's why I don't like Mary Gray's term ghost work, because it's not a ghost work, it's a very real work. But yeah, it's less visible than the one that is on the streets. But how do you create these standards when, as Rafael just said, all the discussions on AI are not necessarily looking at labor standards? So this is a challenge that Fair Work has trying to address somehow, but not only Fair Work, many other researchers are trying to do as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have time for one more question. I have one online, but if nobody in the room wants to invite himself or themselves or herself. So question online is from Pablo Navarrete. They are based at the Universidad Federale Fluminense and the University of Westminster. And they say, first of all, I want to congratulate my friends and comrades for the article and the presentation. As Michael Lowy, 2012, argues, two opposite temptations have been threatening Marxism in Latin America: Eurocentrism and Indo-American exceptionalism. The main example of which is the work of the American Popular Revolutionary Alliance. How do you see this challenge of articulating the specificities of Latin America and the universalities of capital based on the author selected for the analysis? I think that's a very challenging question.
Rafael? So this is the last one, or will we have
If somebody wants to, like, but I think like
otherwise we'll finish with
we can bring the discussion into the pod.
Okay. Rafael, you want
Yeah, first of all, I would like to concur Jonas in relation to acknowledge all the work Fair Work is doing. And many of my reflections on AI is because of Fair Work project too. And for me, this challenge of articulating the specificities or particularities of anything and the universalities are part of the Marxist tradition, and part of our task to connect, and in a dialectical way to connect all the specificity and particularities of our current lives, of the universalities of capital. So for me, it's part of our task.
Okay, so in line with what Rafael just said, I think I kind of introduced something about that. So I'm not the ones that think that we should. I have like a colleague and a friend that is watching us, and she speaks that it's not because you're going to change the syllabus that you're going to change the world. Of course, you need to change the syllabus to know different perspectives about the world, but not necessarily you need just to ban and to deny all the knowledge that was produced, because the Global North also has struggles. You also have movements in the global north, and you have like gender, non-white movements, and like workers' movements as well. So I think that this like Pablo's question it's very relevant in this sense that we're not talking about, we don't want European authors anymore. Let's just read Asian, African, and Latin American. But we need to balance in a way that it's not only about reproducing the same authors on one side, but yeah, to gather the knowledge about how to explain society on the other side. Some people will use one author or other authors or other, I don't know, but in what Pablo is talking about, and I agree with him, I still think that increasingly we have this problem, and I'm sorry to sound repetitive on that. We have the problem of the missing link of capitalism. Like, it's disappear. Like the fact that we are in a capitalist system, it's not only a capitalism system. I don't know how to define China. If someone does, please take this to the pub. But of course, that we have specificities not only in China, but in other situations. We have autocratic systems. We have many problems happening right now. But like in a majority, if we look at the history of the world, we have a more capitalist world than we ever had before. But it's not only a capitalist world. And that's why the critique of Lelia, the critique of Dussel, and the dependence theory is right, because you cannot reduce the problems of capitalism to the labor capital contradiction. You need to incorporate the problems of gender, the problems of race, and other problems. We had a lecture here about 1 year ago in which a former colleague of ours, Murali, came to discuss caste oppression. So in Latin America, we know nothing about caste oppression, but we're talking about like the biggest country, like the most populated country in the world. So yeah, we need to understand the specificity of caste oppression and other specificity of oppressions. And this is why I believe that what Pablo is saying is important. We don't need to like close ourselves in only our cosmovisions, and we need to find these bridges between the analytical tools and theories that we think are relevant, and in a way that we can go from macro theories to micro theories into the ground, as Anna just said.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.